I'm Mary Massie, Manager of Programs and Education here at Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest. For this installment of the Women of Poplar Forest tour, we're going to be talking about two women who came to Poplar Forest most often with Thomas Jefferson, and that's two of his granddaughters, Ellen and Cornelia Randolph. Ellen and Cornelia made their first trip here to Poplar Forest in late June of 1816. At the time of their trip, Ellen was 19 years old and Cornelia was 16. Now, I'm sure that their trip here to Poplar Forest was just as much of an adventure as being here with their grandfather for the first time. It would take 3 days by carriage, typically, to get here from Monticello. And in later years, Ellen and her sister Virginia, who also came here quite often, would reminisce about their travels here to Poplar Forest. Virginia wrote, quote, "I now often think of these journeys. Early in the morning, he was sure to have some additional wrapping to put over the shoulders of each of us. If the weather was cold, we were wrapped in his furs." And later, quote, "Our cold dinner was always put up by his own hands, a pleasant spot by the roadside chosen to eat it, and he was the carver and helped us to our cold fowl and ham and mixed the water and wine to drink it." They both also recall cheerful conversation and even their grandfather singing as they traveled down the road. Ellen wrote to an early Jefferson biographer in 1856, quote, "Our journeys to and from Bedford were almost always pleasant. We always stopped at the same simple country inns where the country people were as much pleased to see the squire as they could have been to meet their own best friends. They set out for him the best they had. These were pleasant times." Now, their days here at Poplar Forest would often start in the same manner. They would have breakfast together in the dining room, and over breakfast they would discuss their plans for the day, if there were any neighbors to go visit or neighbors coming to visit them, any trips to take, or any assignments for the girls to do. Not all visits to neighbors, however, were much looked forward to. Cornelia wrote on one trip, quote, "Tomorrow we go to dine with Mrs. Walker, a neighbor we have never seen, and who has more kindness and willingness to pay us some attention. I am very much obliged to her for her goodwill, but hope my stiff neck may keep me at home." Now, luckily for Cornelia, Mrs. Walker turned out to be a very nice neighbor that they liked. 2 days later, she wrote back to her younger sister, Virginia, quote, "We have found Mrs. Walker such an excellent, kind-hearted woman that we like her better than anybody else, and she seems to be a general favorite." So at least it worked out well for them on that instance. Now, what made Poplar Forest so special for the granddaughters was that they were able to attend to studies and activities and things that they weren't always able to do much of at Monticello. They could read books they wanted to read, study new languages, practice mechanical drawing. We have some examples here of some drawings that Cornelia did here at Poplar Forest of furniture and things that were here. She was learning this skill from her grandfather and was practicing it here, as opposed to at Monticello, where they were kind of constantly hounded by visitors. The girls had a lot of housekeeping duties. They were learning how to run a plantation household from their mother, so they didn't have quite as much leisure time as they would have here at Poplar Forest. However, occasionally a request from their grandfather would take precedence, and they weren't always able to get done the things they wanted to do, such as in 1817 when Cornelia wrote to her sister Virginia, quote, "Tomorrow, Sister Ellen and myself have to put numbers on all of Grandpapa's books, and it will take us nearly the whole day, which I'm very sorry for, because besides wishing to write letters, I should like very well to have copied a beautiful Desdemona from Shakespeare, which I am afraid I can't do now." Now, some trips to Poplar Forest were possibly a little bit more eventful than others. One in particular included a trip from Poplar Forest to Natural Bridge, which is a natural rock formation located near Lexington that Jefferson owned throughout most of his adult life. This trip was very memorable. Cornelia writes quite a detailed letter back to her younger sister about the trip. She wrote that it didn't start off on the greatest of legs. The day that they set out for traveling was, quote, "one of the most disagreeable days for traveling that could be. There was a carriage accident on their way up to the Natural Bridge where the carriage and the horses almost fell through a bridge. And then they finally make it to an inn to spend the night. It looks decent enough from the outside, and when they go in, they find out it's one of the filthiest places that they've ever seen. It was so dirty, in fact, that Cornelia and Ellen refused to sleep in the covers or under the covers of their bed. Cornelia slept on top of the sheets, and Ellen paced most of the night. They survived their night in this inn. They set out in pouring down rain the next morning to make it to Natural Bridge. Thankfully, they made it. Clearly, it had very much of an impression. Cornelia wrote later that from the top of the bridge, she had a hard time really determining how tall and big the structure was. And when they got down to the base, she noticed that what she thought were ferns growing at the base of the bridge were actually walnut trees. So you can see how big and imposing the natural bridge must have been for these two young women. Now the trip was so memorable, in fact, that it took Cornelia about 2 days to write her sister Virginia the letter, and it took all of the paper that Cornelia had left. So clearly a very memorable trip. And so their visits to Poplar Forest went. They came here almost, or at least 2 grandchildren would come with Jefferson on almost every trip he took to Poplar Forest, starting in that first trip in 1816 until his last trip in 1823. Ellen and Cornelia came more often than anybody else, so we often refer to them on our house tours. And in later years, about 30 years after Jefferson passed away, Ellen writes to an early Jefferson biographer recounting her memories about their time here at Poplar Forest, and she writes, quote, "We saw too more of our dear grandfather at those times than at any other. He interested himself in all we did, thought, or read. He would talk to us about his own youth and early friends, and tell us stories of former days. He seemed really to take as much pleasure in these conversations with us as if we had been older and wiser people." Now, Ellen and Cornelia both go on to live very long and what we can assume were good lives. Ellen marries in 1825. She marries Joseph Coolidge, the son of a prominent businessman in Boston. They met while Joseph was traveling to Virginia the year before in 1824 and are married in the parlor at Monticello. After their wedding and their honeymoon, they moved back to Boston in Massachusetts, and Ellen lives there for the rest of her life. She dies in 1876 and is buried in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now, Cornelia does not marry when she gets older. She stays unmarried her entire adult life. Because of that, she's living with some of her siblings. She lives with Thomas Jefferson Randolph, her older brother, for most of her adult life at his plantations. At Edge Hill, the plantation Thomas Jefferson Randolph inherits from his parents, they even start a school in the 1830s where Cornelia is able to teach drawing, sculpture, and painting, some skills that she was able to study and practice here at Poplar Forest. After the Civil War, she moves to Alexandria, Virginia, lives with 2 of her sisters at the home of one of her nieces, and she dies in 1871 and is buried in the family cemetery at Monticello.